正義はここにある。強靭な悪が海にあるならば、我々海軍がそれを全力で駆逐せねばならんのだ。絶対的正義の名のもとに。
Absolute justice is that which is complete and total. Best exemplified through Sakazuki, it represents the ideal of what the world government desires from its men: loyalty and complete adherence to the systems in place. When the Marine fails, it's not a fault of the system, it's the fault of the Marine. Marines unable to uphold this standard are not fit to be in service of the system. And yet, this absolute justice is anything but. The world at large is full of enemies who reject the government's idea of justice, and even those within its ranks aim to follow their own codes. Where Sakazuki's sense of justice is what the powers that be most want from its men, the one who best understands what the Marines are is Smoker, who insists everyone follow their own personal justice. And in the pursuit of that personal justice, he routinely butts heads with those above him, those who demand he be subservient. Smoker is ultimately restrained in achieving his sense of right because he is within a system that demands something impossible of him. Like Giant Jack says just before the opening quote, Marines can sail away from their duty at any time. They volunteer themselves in the service for whatever reason they so choose, whatever justice they so choose, committing themselves under authority for a place in serving under the most powerful force in the world. By nature, they must have something to gain beyond duty, this personal motive being why so many fall to corruption, acting as they please through the power offered by the Marines. Even not having personal desires is a form of personal justice, such as in regards to Borsellino's unclear justice. While not as extreme as absolute justice, Borsellino's is that which still primarily follows orders. Borsellino is largely seen acting not of his own initiative, but adhering to what he's been told, his actions less active and more reactive. Where Kuzan sought Robin of his own accord, Borsellino only made the move on Savoti after St. Charlos was attacked. The bit of initiative he did once show, when news of Big Mom heading to Wano reached the Marines, was still beholden to Sakazuki, who gave the final word on whether or not the Marines should act. Where someone like Smoker wouldn't have let such authority get in the way of his personal justice if it came down to it. Doing as needed and doing it with as much power as needed without regard for any personal sense of justice, Borsellino being slow of mind doesn't matter much if he is loyal and with great power. That said, this ideal of unclear justice doesn't seem that unclear. The Vivre card extra information even specifies why, noting that it's purposely unspecified so that Borsellino doesn't have to care too much about it. His sense of justice is not unclear, but lazy, deliberately passive so he doesn't have to think or care too much about what he does, simply serving the system without regard. Such thoughtlessness is dangerous in itself, as in removing himself from his practice and duties as a Marine, he becomes an agent of complacency, letting the issues plaguing the government and Marines run free as long as he isn't ordered otherwise, because it's easy. It doesn't matter why Luffy attacked St. Charlos, just the fact that in doing so he became an enemy of the system. But while Borsellino's unclear justice is the result of his laziness, not everyone can so easily put aside their own personal sense of justice for the sake of not starting trouble, as while he claims to follow lazy justice, Kuzan's ideals are the result of his own uncertainty. Why these two follow an inverted sense of justice is unknown, as Kuzan is more commonly contrasted with Sakazuki. Kuzan once followed fired up, or burning justice, implying a passion for the Marines that has since gone cold. And if the reason has already been shown in the story, then it is doubtlessly the Ohara incident, where the extermination of scholars seeking knowledge led to the massacre of innocents, and a former Marine directly fighting the system he was once part of for the sake of a blameless child. Kuzan's burning passion for justice became cold like ice in the wake of the atrocity, where Sakazuki, never punished for his extreme actions, still burns brightly, his intensity only rewarded. With a peer like Sakazuki, it's only understandable he has doubts in the system. During the war, while Whitebeard rampages, the three even give comments reflecting their various ideals. Borsellino responds to Akainu's remark about the ice, telling him to melt it himself if he has a problem, deflecting duty away from his lazy self as he has no obligation to do anything in particular without orders. Sakazuki blamed the ice for the footing Whitebeard and his men had, putting fault for the situation on the failings of a certain individual Marine, deflecting away from Kuzan's comment about how the siege walls not being raised fast enough was the reason Whitebeard's attack needed to be blocked in the first place. Kuzan placing the blame on the system he doubts, where Sakazuki supported the system and blamed Kuzan. Putting a sense of good against a system that would rather him ignore his own will and simply follow orders made him uncertain, pushing him to make concessions for the likes of Robin and Luffy in willful moves outside the system. And only when he becomes free of it does he stop being filled with uncertainty. Compare his meeting with Doflamingo to Isho's. Isho, a marine, had to consider the system and its rules when dealing with one warlord who broke them and another who didn't. Both were technically government allies, but while one employed a mass-murdering scientist, he hadn't gone against the system and allied with a pirate, leaving him in the right and the other in the wrong. But Kuzan was no longer part of the system, and thus could have no reservations in defending a marine from a villain regardless of the laws and systems at play. Where Borsalino has no personal desires, and Kuzan's personal desires had him eventually leaving the system, Rob Lucci's dark justice is even more self-serving. Within the orders he's given, he follows them as he can with the specific purpose in trying to shed as much blood as possible for his personal enjoyment. But while this is certainly dark in its own right, it still pales in comparison to absolute justice. I would argue that the best moment for contrasting them is when Lucci deliberately lets Chimney and Gonbi go unnoticed in hopes that they would help Luffy reach him. Searching for a good battle, he chose to fight Luffy, letting enemies go free to enable that simply because he wasn't ordered otherwise, doing something that endangered the overall mission for his personal desires. However, absolute justice goes beyond the letter of the law in service of its spirit. Sakazuki was never ordered to kill innocents on Ohara. He chose to in an attempt to ensure that the spirit of the mission was carried out by exterminating all enemies, effectively taking the action opposite of Lucci with Chimney and Gonbe. Rather than endanger the mission for any reason, Sakazuki sacrificed hundreds. It didn't matter that Ace had already died for the war. If Marines were capable of fighting, and pirates were retreating right in front of them, then those enemies had to be exterminated. Sakazuki is a zealot who aims to destroy all enemies to the government without discrimination, no matter what else is destroyed in the process. And it's this that makes him even more dangerous and terrifying than a cold-blooded killer like Lucci. In making the enemies of the government his enemies, he has no morals except adherence to his vision of the spirit of the system, one he sees no flaw in whatsoever. They bring peace, therefore they are justice. They are right. Stubborn and hot-headed, Sakazuki is blind to other perspectives, a turn of phrase I use to draw attention to Isho, one who vehemently disagrees with absolute justice in favor of his reasonable justice. And like the other admirals and their less than straightforward naming schemes, what is reasonable about his sense of justice is questionable. While he puts intense focus on protecting the innocent, like Borsalino, he adheres to the letter of the law, especially in regards to the warlord system he wishes to see abolished. When Doflamingo instated the birdcage, Maynard directly asked why Isho wasn't attempting to arrest Doflamingo, despite the obviousness of his crimes in the form of the then freed toys. To this, Isho asked if people thought the world government was supposed to be some kind of god. Rather than being done out of complacency, Isho's actions are deliberate, aiming to reveal the flaws of the system that allows the warlords to act largely as they please. Even though the leaders of the government claim to be gods, their systems are flawed and human. So by acting as an agent of that system up to the point where innocents are at risk, even against his own distaste for the warlords, he's able to show the world the failings of the warlord system where previously, in Alabasta, the government covered up transgressions of their men. He blindly pushes reason to the point of being unreasonable, forcing others to admit the failings of the government or else bend and break under the system and what it stands for. Because at the core of Dressrosa's conflict was a man who echoed everything wrong. A pirate and a warlord, he freely abused the system, and as a former heavenly dragon he even sought perfect godhood, simply because he was born. Doflamingo's blood right to rule Dressrosa is one that extends to every kingdom forming the world government. Every allied nation is headed by a king or queen, maintained through blood succession by nature, emulating the same right to rule as the heavenly dragons. The strongest power was formed by the 20 kings whose descendants still retain that rule, but those currently in power did not do anything to achieve this themselves. They were simply born, and to hold on to that divine right to rule, blood becomes everything. Because they were born to these bloodlines, they are blessed with the tributes of all government-aligned countries. They take so much, and only a select few have anything to give back, generally in the form of leadership. The heavenly dragons are by and large leeches, accepted simply because they were born, and as a result, to those in the system, blood must be recognized to have value. When Ace is about to be executed, it's not his battles with the government or actions as a pirate that are on trial, but rather his death is justified because he is the son of Gold Roger, one far worse in the eyes of the government than Ace ever was. Sakazuki cries for Luffy's death at the war, not for Enies Lobby or the defeat of 2 warlords, but because he is the son of Dragon. Even those against or outside of the government often lean on the idea of blood and its value, not knowing anything else to emulate. Military dictatorships or democracies don't exist. The strongest pirates ruling as emperors, Big Mom even calling herself Queen of Totland. After Walpole's forced abdication, Dalton was reluctantly crowned king, continuing the monarchy of Drum Island through the Sakura Kingdom, one that still demands rule by blood even though he took the crown through the will of people. Being born isn't a crime, and yet that human truth becomes a statement resisting the rule of the current body of power, as if being born can be a blessing to some, then it stands to reason that for others it's a curse. And when this is called into question, even many of those who benefit may come to see the arbitrarity of blood. King Stelly has only known nobility and privilege, even becoming a king through marriage and regicide. He was handed special status in life and still tries to climb higher, asking Garp how he might become a heavenly dragon, and lusting to sit on the empty throne the moment he sees it. And as the revolutionaries declare war, not on the government, but on the heavenly dragons, those who fight in their defense will ultimately be protecting their status as second-class citizens. They are less valuable, not being gods, yet fight to preserve the godhood of others. Echoing my Doflamingo video, in fighting for a human that calls himself a god and willingly being below them, they limit their humanity, their complacency in the system allowing the so-called gods to have their absolute freedom. A heavenly dragon could reduce a king to a slave because they choose to, and while a slave can become a well-respected man, and while a well-respected man can become a king, no king can ever become a heavenly dragon, for the mere act of climbing that waterfall stands against everything they represent, proving that their blood doesn't matter. Like those of Grey Terminal suffered for not being born into nobility, so too might anyone not being born a heavenly dragon should that come into question. With Isho challenging the stagnant system from within, he inevitably butts heads with his superiors, his actions a transgression against the attempts at maintaining a quiet peace. But peace and quiet are not the same. The world may be quiet, devoid of large-scale war, it is hardly peaceful, dissent growing by the day, emphasized by the Revolutionary Army who gradually take more and more control away from the world government. As control slips, the government attempts to regain what they are losing. Sakazuki's zealotry, despite its extreme nature, is something evident in the Marines from early parts of the story where even unknown pirates were valid targets for attack just for flying a flag. Regardless of morals, enemies of the government cannot exist, for they are opponents of peace. The world in the midst of that age of piracy is one where that centuries-long grasp of power is finally beginning to slip. As Doflamingo stated during the war, justice is the arbitrary result of power, as those who dominate the world decide what is right. And it is for this exact reason that the government so desperately holds on to power, because otherwise the world might question the ideals that they stand for. Some might feel as though their desires or beliefs are worth compromising on in exchange for peace. Garp has lost family for his refusal to go against the Marines, even as he secretly works behind their back. His free spirit that doesn't always align with the government still keeps that relation even at the cost of family, as it is a spirit that ultimately values peace. As he tells Gold Lion Shiki on Marineford, the East Blue is a weak sea, but it is peaceful, therefore of value. Yet through the story we see it is just as vulnerable to tyranny as any place in the world, and that low bounties and quiet don't necessarily mean weakness or peace. With other rulers rising to power, peace becomes an illusion, and neither side inherently becomes more right than the other through the arbitrary nature of holding power, which makes the line between how respective sides rule come to blur. Where the government demands heavenly tribute, Big Mom takes lifespan. Where the government pushes for the value of blood and birthright, Big Mom, personal hypocrisy aside, seeks equality among all races. With multiple sides there will inevitably be conflict, and a lack of peace, but in choosing sides, the original status quo can be questioned and challenged. Roger kickstarted an age of change, and those in power desperately try to keep things as they were. In fear of the war that will change everything, their justice must be absolute. So Sakazuki stands as Fleet Admiral, rewarded for his horrifying zealotry because it suits those at the top. As long as absolute justice reigns for peace, the Marines put aside their individual, personal justice. But for the world at large, to remain complacent and stand still, letting the powers that be, is already the norm, already picking a side. And the question all those who stand still will have to ask is if it's worth standing still for the illusion of peace when the world is on the cusp of war, or if they should fight and risk their lives for what they believe in. Another one down. Thank you so much for your continued support. And I would also like to thank my patrons such as Nonamion, Flarbu, Maz, Gloogle, Oliver Mort, Luis Segura, and Mohammed Akim. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.